You are watching Rituals of Dread. In December 1879, on the far edge of Maine's coastline, in the isolated fishing village of Harbor Falls, a chain of events began that the local newspaper would later call the most sinister series of incidents in the history of Penobscot County. In just 3 months, 6 people died under circumstances officially deemed accidental. But those who lived there told a different story. At the center of every tragedy was a 10-year-old girl named Emily Woods. Official records list her as an orphan, having lost both parents. But the personal diaries of Dr. Nathan Wells, the only physician in Harbor Falls, tell another story, one far more frightening than anyone could have imagined. Her gaze was not that of a child. It was as if she was watching you to figure out where and how you could hurt the most. From the Diary of Dr. Wells, January 17, 1880. Before we dive into the chilling chronicle of these events, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you won't miss our breakdowns of the darkest and most mysterious cases of the 19th century. And in the comments, tell us where you're from and whether you believe a child can truly be a source of evil. Emily Wood's story does not begin with a murder, but with a storm. On the night of December 2, 1879, Harbor Falls was struck by the worst hurricane in 20 years. Fishing boats were smashed across the bay, several houses were partially destroyed, and at dawn, the body of Thomas Woods, Emily's father, was found on the shore. According to witnesses, his face looked as if he had died not from drowning, but from terror. That same day, Mrs. Agnes Woods, the late man's cousin, knocked on Dr. Wells's door. Standing behind her, holding an old Eyeless doll, was Emily. The girl wasn't shivering from the cold, wasn't crying, and didn't even ask what had happened to her father. She simply looked at the doctor the way one looks not at a person, but at an object. I thought then that her eyes reflected the sea, but not the calm one, the one that takes people. From the Diary of Dr. Wells, December 2, 1879. By the late 19th century, Maine's coast was a chain of small fishing settlements hidden among rocks and coves. Harbor Falls was one of the most inaccessible, reachable only by sea or by an old dirt road that often became impassable in winter snowstorms. The locals mostly caught cod and lobster. Harsh weather and the constant nearness of the ocean shaped their characters into ones free of excess sentimentality. Everyone here knew the sea gave and the sea took away. In 1879, Harbor Falls had just 312 residents. In winter, houses hid from the wind behind cliffs, and at night the only sounds were the ocean's roar and the creak of shutters. The local St. Elias Church, built in 1830, served both as a place of worship and as a meeting hall. Disputes were settled there, fishing hauls discussed, and memorial services held for lost sailors. In such communities, tragedy rarely went unnoticed, especially if it kept happening again and again. The first oddities. The death of John Merrill. The first incident Dr. Wells recorded in connection with Emily took place on December 14, 1879. John Merrill was an experienced fisherman who had lived in Harbor Falls all his life. Known as cautious and even overly superstitious, he never went to sea without the silver cross inherited from his father and refused to sail with anyone he considered unclean aboard. That day, the sea was calm, and John went out to check his nets in Center Bay, only 3 miles from the village. When he hadn't returned by evening, the search began. His boat was found by a reef empty, nets full of cod, and barefoot child-sized prints on the wet gunnel. They were small footprints, and fresh though no one was around. The tracks led to the edge of the boat and stopped there. Testimony of fisherman Peter Norris, Inquest Protocol, December 1879. John's body was found the next day on the shore, face up, eyes wide open. His lips were blue, but there was almost no water in his lungs. Official cause of death, heart attack. That same evening, Mrs. Agnes Woods came to Mr. Kelly's shop for flour and salt. Emily was with her, in a thin gray dress, no shawl. One of the customers, old Liam Howell, noticed the girl's dress was wet to the knees as if she'd been standing in water. I asked Agnes what happened, and she said Emily likes walking by the shore. But in our village, we know, on December 14th, the water's iced to your knees, and no one goes in just for fun. From the Recollections of Liam Howell, 1895. The Flooded Hunt House. The second incident happened on December 27th, at the home of the Hunt family. Thomas and Rose Hunt lived in a single-story cottage by the western cliff. Thomas had gone out that morning to mend nets in the shed. Rose had gone to her sister's house next door. When they returned at midday, the floor of their home was covered in seawater up to the ankles. All windows and doors were shut, roof and walls intact, furniture soaked, but no sign of a break-in or storm damage. Dr. Wells examined the scene and noted the water level was perfectly even, as if it had been poured in deliberately, then left. Most strange of all, in the center of the living room stood a wooden eyeless doll, its hair wet seaweed. The Hunts swore they had never seen it before. When asked if they had noticed anyone near the house recently, Rose, after a long pause, replied, I saw a girl, Emily. She was standing on the road, right across from us, and smiling. Martin Quinn's well. On January 3, 1880, an 8-year-old boy, Tom Quinn, son of the local carpenter, disappeared. He was searched for 2 days. On the morning of the third day, his father heard faint knocking from the old well behind the shed. When it was opened, they found Tom standing waist-deep in icy water. He was alive but barely speaking. He claimed a pretty girl had asked him to look at the light in the water, and then the well's lid had closed. Dr. Wells noted the well had been covered with heavy boards and stones, impossible for an 8-year-old to lift on his own. Once he recovered, Tom described the girl. Long dark hair, gray dress, eyeless doll in hand. That same morning, the doctor met Emily on the street. She stopped, looked him in the eyes, and asked, Doctor, is it true that in cold water you first stop feeling, and then fall asleep? By 1879, Dr. Wells had been in Harbor Falls for 8 years. Moving here from Boston after a brief stint at a marine hospital clinic, he had become the only qualified physician for miles. Dry, strict, and methodical, he kept detailed records of every case he encountered. Bound into 3 thick leather volumes, these notes would later form the basis of our account. He was the first to notice that in every tragedy following the December 2nd storm, Emily Woods appeared in some way. Emily had been born in Harbor Falls in 1869. Her mother, Elizabeth Woods, died in spring 1879 of consumption. Her father, Thomas, a fisherman of 20 years, sailed until his last day, even when others stayed ashore. After his death, Emily was taken in by her cousin Agnes, a strict but capable 43-year-old. Her home stood on the edge of a cliff, where sunlight rarely reached in winter. Locals claimed Emily rarely came into the village. She was sometimes seen on the cliff above the water, standing motionless for hours, staring at the ocean. Fishermen joked she was counting waves, but some old-timers whispered the girl reminded them of drowned bodies washed ashore, the same pallor, the same stillness. She was too quiet, even for an orphan. Children her age cry, seek attention. Emily seemed to be waiting for something. Not for us, for something else. Mrs. Rose Hunt, neighbor of Agnes. The Diaries of Dr. Nathan Wells. Entry, January 4th, 1880. This morning I met Emily Woods near St. Elias Church. Snow up to the ankles, wind from the bay cutting to the bone. She stood without a shawl, doll in hand. Dress thin, hem wet. I offered to walk her home, but she said she was waiting for the roar of the waves that will take someone away. I didn't understand what she meant, but there was no hint of a joke in her voice. Entry, January 9th, 1880. After the Quinn boy incident, I began watching the girl more closely. Several times I saw her in places children don't usually go. The edge of the western cliff, the old piers, the lighthouse ruins. Once, at dusk, I saw her standing on the ice near a crack, as if peering in. I called to her, but she slowly turned and simply stared at me, long intently, until I felt a chill not from the wind, but from her gaze. Entry, January 14th, 1880. Mrs. Agnes complains Emily sleeps poorly. Says the girl gets out of bed at night, goes outside, and returns only by morning, bringing wet stones, shells, and sometimes dead fish into the house. Agnes asked me to speak with her niece, but in conversation Emily insisted she was collecting gifts. When I asked who they were for, she answered, "For those who will soon go under the water." I asked what she meant and she said, "You'll see." Entry, January 17th, 1880. Today I noticed animals avoid Emily. Mr. Kelly's cat's fur stood on end when she passed. The horses in Howell's stable began thrashing when she approached the door. Even the seagulls at the pier took off, though she merely looked at them. This is not ordinary childish withdrawal. Her presence seems to disturb all living things. I am beginning to fear for Agnes. Entry, January 20th, 1880. Today Emily asked me a question I cannot get out of my head. "Doctor, do you think it's possible to hold your breath so long that the heart forgets it needs to beat?" I tried to explain the physiology, but she interrupted. "I think it's possible. I've seen it happen." By this point, Dr. Wells, like Dr. Harding in Timothy's story, was no longer merely suspicious. He was gathering evidence. He could already see the pattern. Every incident happened near water, all within the areas where Emily was often seen. The night of January 24th, 1880. That day, a heavy leaden cloud hung over Harbor Falls. By evening, a fine snow began to fall, turning by midnight into a dense blizzard, with gusts strong enough to bend the pines along the cliff. The road to Agnes's house was nearly buried under drifts. Dr. Wells had no intention of going there in such weather, but around 10 o'clock a messenger boy knocked on his door. His coat was dusted with snow, and fear was written on his face. "Mrs. Woods, she asked you to come. She says something's wrong with Emily." Wells took a lantern, his medical bag, and set out. The wind lashed his face, snow crunching under his boots, each step thudding in the muffled silence, broken only by the blizzard's howl. Agnes's house stood on the cliff's edge, and with every yard, the path grew more treacherous. Ocean wind drove snow straight into his eyes. Suddenly, near the cliff, he saw a dark figure, small, thin, motionless. He raised the lantern and saw Emily. She stood holding her eyeless doll, staring down at the black water where the icy waves pounded the rocks below. "Emily," he called. The girl slowly turned her head and smiled. But it was not a child's smile. It was a look of satisfaction, the expression of someone watching a plan come together. "Auntie's asleep," she said. "I made it so she could rest peacefully." Inside, the heat from the stove struck his face. But it was an oppressive heat, the kind you feel in a room where the fire has burned too long. Agnes lay on the kitchen floor, her face pale, lips dry, breathing shallowly. 3 buckets filled with seawater stood around her. The air smelled of salt and something metallic. The doctor knelt, checking her pulse. Slow but steady, not like a heart attack, more like poisoning. "What did you do to her, Emily?" he asked without turning. "She said she was cold," came the reply. "I brought her the sea, so it could warm her from the inside." As he gave Agnes warm water and tried to rouse her, his eyes fell on the doll. It sat on the table, leaning against a bowl as if watching. Its hair of seaweed was wet, and a drop slid down its wooden cheek, leaving a trace like a tear. In that moment, he realized he no longer felt like a doctor here to help. He felt like an object of observation. The next day, January 25th, after the incident at Agnes's house, Dr. Wells went to the village headman, Mr. Jonas Crane. Crane sat by the fire in his shop, listening in silence as the doctor spoke, stroking his gray beard. "You want me to tell people a 10-year-old girl is poisoning neighbors and drowning fishermen?" he said at last. Doctor, half the village is already half mad with winter fear. They don't need a new terror. Jonas, I'm not asking for a public announcement. I just want Emily temporarily sent to the mission house in Bangor. There she'll be under watch. The headman scratched his temple, then nodded. All right, I'll speak to Tom Howell and Peter Norris. They'll help take her. Quietly. Tonight. That evening, Wells returned to Agnes's home, ostensibly to check her condition. The woman was pale and tired but sitting by the fire. Emily sat on the floor, doll in hand, drawing with charcoal on an old newspaper. What are you drawing? Wells asked. The girl slowly turned the paper toward him. On it were 3 male figures dragging a small dark-haired girl. At their feet were waves. Behind them, a black abyss. What does this mean? He asked, keeping his voice even. Those are the ones who will try to take me tonight, Emily said, meeting his eyes. And what will happen to them on the way? By 10 o'clock, with the storm slightly abated, a sleigh pulled by Tom Howell's horse arrived. Inside sat Tom, Peter Norris, and Headman Jonas. They looked tense but determined. Doctor, you're sure about this? Peter asked, stepping inside. I've got a bad feeling. It'll be fine, Wells replied. We're just taking the girl somewhere safe. When the men entered, Emily rose and gently placed her doll on the table. You want to take me? She asked. Yes, Emily, Jonas said. Just for a little while. All right? She nodded. But take warm clothes. The road will be longer than you think. Why do you say that? Tom frowned. Emily stepped up close to him, lifted her head, and whispered, Because you won't be coming back. They wrapped her in a blanket and set her in the sleigh. The doctor followed behind as they headed down the hill toward the road. Half an hour later, a cry rang out in the village. Tom's horse had returned alone, frothing and blowing, the sleigh empty. Rope-like scratches marked its flank. The 3 men were never seen again. The doctor realized that the attempt at isolation had not only failed, but might have been part of Emily's plan. 2 evenings later, he returned to Agnes's house. She lay in bed, weak but alive. Emily sat on the floor by the window, gazing at the gray winter sea. Emily, he began, I want to talk to you. She did not turn. You want to ask where they went? Yes. Emily turned her head and smiled faintly. They're where everyone who gets in the way goes. And where is that? Where the water's warm, even in winter. The doctor sat across from her, setting his medical bag on the floor. You understand people call that murder? They call it that because they're afraid. I'm just testing. Testing what? How long the heart remembers to beat. How fast the eyes stop seeing. How many words a person can say when they know they won't breathe again. She spoke calmly, as if explaining a game's rules. And why do you need to know that? Emily looked him straight in the eye. Because no one else wants to know. In that cold gaze he saw no hatred, no malice, no joy. Only pure curiosity, the kind that knows no limits. And what are you going to do next? He asked. You're clever, doctor, she replied. Guess. I think you'll try to test it on me. She nodded. You'll understand better than anyone. She rose, went to the table and picked up the doll. Holding it by the waist in her left hand, she reached under her dress with her right and drew out a long, thin length of sea cord. Its ends were wet, and it smelled of salt. In the water, ropes slip, Emily said. In the air, they cut the skin. I want to understand what a person feels when they realize that water and air are equally dangerous. The doctor felt his throat go dry. The thought flashed through his mind. Exactly what she had intended, to watch his choice. Save Agnes, fight, or run. But all he had time to notice was the glint in her eyes. Not from anger, but from anticipation. At that moment, a cry rang out beyond the window. Someone was calling the doctor by name. Nathan. This isn't just a child. The village has whispered rumors for years, ever since your first patients died. Those who've seen her by the water say she brings the sea with her." Dr. Wells frowned. "You mean to say this is Emily?" "Yes." The elder lowered his gaze to his hands. "People avoid her when they can. Fishermen won't sail certain parts of the bay, and not just out of fear for their catch. Those who've spoken to her all tell the same story. Her gaze, it's not a child's. It's studying cold, like ice." "I've seen it myself," Wells said, clenching his fists. "Yesterday she was standing at the cliff, and then she did something to Aunt Agnes." The elder shook his head. "You must understand, Nathan, we've never said it aloud, but her family, they've always been different. The old folk used to say the woods came from places people are afraid to look. Not just sea tribes, but places where what flows isn't water, but something ancient and wicked." The doctor felt his blood run cold. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "Be careful. And watch. No one can force the girl to be good. She alone decides when the sea will take someone, and we've learned to live with it." Wells returned home to his small clinic on the hill, but sleep would not come. Every creak of the shutters, every gust of wind felt like someone was nearby, watching. He remembered Emily's mother's diary, notes about a girl the old sea legends had never left alone. The night of January 26th brought another storm. First, a piece of the doctor's roof was torn away, then came a knock on the window. Wells raised his lantern. Emily was standing beyond the glass. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't smiling. Only the eyeless doll in her hands swayed gently. "Doctor," she said softly, "I've come to show you what happens next." Before he could answer, the wind tore the door from its hinges and the blizzard burst inside. Wells smelled the sea, icy and rotten at once. He heard the doll softly tapping against the floor, though the girl stood still. "Why are you doing this?" he shouted, struggling to keep his balance. "Because they're coming," Emily replied. "And those who aren't ready will go with them." By morning, the village had found another building gone. This time it was the old dockside warehouse, where nets and fish crates were stored. Inside stood icy water, and on the floor lay the eyeless doll, wet and cold, as if just pulled from the sea. None of the owners were found. Dr. Wells understood. There would be no simple explanations. He began a separate notebook, records of the girl with the eyes of the sea. In it, he noted everything he saw, heard, and felt, trying to find a pattern, to understand her motives, and perhaps find a way to stop the chain of horrors. But the more he wrote, the clearer it became that not only Emily was watching, someone or something was watching through her. And each night, when he closed the notebook, he heard a faint laughter far away, as though the sea itself was answering his thoughts. The next chapter of Emily Woods' story promised to be even darker. By January 1880, only a handful of people in Harbor Falls had yet to see her up close, and each new day could be the last. Night of January 26, 1880. The forest around the village lay in complete darkness, only the rare glints of the moon sliding across the sparkling snow, as if nature itself was trying to light a cold nightmare. Snow fell without cease, weighing down rooftops, breaking from branches in squeaking, crunching masses. The wind carried darkness and cold through the streets, seeping into the cracks of wooden buildings, making them groan and tremble like living beings suffering from an unknown terror. Agnes's house stood in shadow, almost merging with the darkness. Its frost-covered windows reflected the faint light of lanterns piercing the night. Inside, dead silence reigned. Agnes slept, but her sleep was restless, broken. Her breath caught, her body trembled. She felt the presence of something alien and dangerous. On the table lay a doll. It was oddly, skillfully made, with snow-white skin and long arms, but no eyes. Its head was slightly tilted toward the door, as though the doll was watching every step in the room. Dr. Wells, a seasoned man who had long lost faith in the ordinary, was the first to enter the house. He knew the girl he had come to check on was no ordinary child. The force emanating from her was frighteningly tangible, an invisible energy compressing the air, making it shiver, and his heart beat faster. Emily stood in the corner of the room, clutching the doll in cold hands. Her gaze was icy, unmoving, as though she saw something beyond the walls, something no one else could. Soon other men burst into the house, armed with torches and lanterns. They meant to take the girl by force, but as soon as they drew near, an irresistible threat radiated from her silent presence. The room filled with a strange sound, like whispers coming from the walls, as if the space itself tried to stop them. Suddenly, Emily vanished. On the floor lay only the doll, now not just eyeless, but with a clear liquid slowly running down its wooden cheek, forming a small hissing circle, an icy puddle, as if to warn that the girl's presence could not be ignored. Dr. Wells realized she was not a child. Emily had become something of another nature, and her power grew by the minute. She was no longer merely part of this world. She was reshaping it. The village, the houses, the people, everything bent to her silent will. While others tried to stop her with force, she was already planning actions that could end in tragedy. The wind howled outside, snow lashed the walls, and the silence within the house became unbearable. Every object, every sound seemed subject to one will, Emily's. Even the doll, cold and lifeless at first glance, was now part of her strange, ominous presence. The night deepened, and Agnes's house seemed to breathe. Shadows crawled along the walls, stretching and shrinking like living creatures. The wind outside gathered strength, slipping through cracks, making the doors creak and the old floorboards shudder. There was no room here for ordinary fear. Every sound, every rustle carried meaning. Emily sat on the floor, clutching the doll. Her eyes were closed, but her mind no longer belonged to her body or to this world. She saw the village from above, as if floating over the rooftops, and every living creature obeyed her gaze. She could feel people's thoughts, predict their actions, guide their movements, whispering with an invisible voice. Dr. Wells stood by the door, gripping his lantern, a cold shiver running down his spine. He knew simple intervention would not be enough. Emily had become something else, a spirit of power, ancient and dangerous. He remembered the old legends of children who bore forces capable of changing reality, and how such powers rarely allowed themselves to be controlled. Suddenly, the light in the house went out. The lamp on the table extinguished on its own, plunging the room into complete darkness. Only the doll on the floor glimmered faintly with a pale silver light. This light did not come from flame, it came from Emily herself. And in that moment, the man heard a quiet but distinct whisper. "You are too close." Invisible hands seemed to close around his chest, squeezing his heart, forcing him to his knees. The fear was not physical, it was inside, invading his mind. The doctor understood that any attempt to take the girl by force would end in disaster. Meanwhile, strange things began happening in the village. Livestock behaved erratically, doors and windows shut by themselves, and quiet whispers came from empty houses. Some saw shadows sliding through the streets, as if the village itself had come alive under an unseen influence. Emily rose. Her body remained on the floor, but her mind floated above the village. She felt loneliness and cold, but also a power she had never known before. She realized she could now do whatever she wanted with the village. And in her small heart, full of strange understanding, a thought began to grow. This power was her freedom, and she would give it up to no one. Dr. Wells opened his mouth to speak, but Emily's whisper filled his mind, cutting off his words. "Leave or become part of me." And suddenly he knew the struggle would be not for her body, but for her soul. Whoever yielded first would lose everything. Snow kept falling, the village went still, and the night grew longer, as if reality itself trembled before the power carried by the little girl with the eyeless doll. By the first hours of the night, the village had become a trap. Shadows that had once been only tricks of light and wind now moved on their own. They stretched and thickened, taking the shapes of people long dead. Someone would hear a familiar voice calling from the darkness, and each time they followed it, they would find themselves in an empty field, only icy snow and nothingness. Emily saw it all. She seemed dissolved into the night itself, guiding every movement, every whisper. People tried to gather to figure out what was happening, but their thoughts became tangled. They couldn't remember why they had come outside, who among the neighbors was missing, or who had stayed behind closed doors. Their minds bent to the little girl who did not move from the floor, yet was everywhere. Dr. Wells stood at the window holding the doll in his hands. He knew that no simple ritual or incantation would help. He would have to enter Emily's mind. But how could one reach a place where there was no body, only absolute power and emptiness? From the darkness came a sound. A slow, quiet knock on the window, as if someone were calling. When Wells came closer, he saw the faces of villagers. They were distorted, their eyes wide with horror, and each one whispered the same words. "She sees everything. She's everywhere." As if in answer, the doll in the doctor's hands began to glow brighter, and Emily's eyes opened. In the room where she sat, the air grew cold as winter frost crept inside. The whispers grew louder, turning into voices that could drown out any rational thought. Emily rose, though her body remained on the floor. Her shadow spread across the room, and the darkness itself became a dense substance, pressing on everything around. The doctor realized that if he could not claim even a fragment of her consciousness, the village would remain forever in the grasp of this small yet all-powerful being. Then the doll moved on its own, as if waking. The empty glass sockets in its face flared with red light, and from within the whispers came one clear voice. Not Emily's, but the doll's. "Now the game begins, and no one leaves alive." The night swallowed the village completely. Shadows from the houses and streets merged into a single darkness, and the whispers became screams, echoing in every mind. Emily stood in the middle of the square, her body unmoving, but her eyes burning with red light, reflecting the abyss. The doll in Dr. Wells's hands trembled, as if reminding him that the line between the living and the dead had vanished. Wells realized that the only way to stop Emily was to destroy the source of her power, her own consciousness, before it could completely consume everyone. He lifted the doll and spoke the incantation that might give him a chance to regain control. First, nothing happened. But then Emily's eyes blinked, and her shadow began to waver, like water under a fierce wind. The whispers grew chaotic, losing their rhythm, breaking into shrieks. The village shuddered, roofs groaned. Snow rose into a whirling storm, and the darkness began to crack like brittle glass. Emily screamed, a scream that belonged neither to a child nor a doll, but to the night itself. And in that moment, the doll in Wells's hands shattered into millions of tiny fragments, each one swallowing a piece of her essence. The red light in her eyes went out, and the darkness dispersed. By morning, the village looked as if the night had never come. Snow glittered in the first rays of sunlight, houses stood unharmed, and the villagers, exhausted but alive, slowly emerged from their homes like people waking from a nightmare they couldn't fully remember. Emily was gone. All that remained was a small, eyeless doll lying in the snow. Dr. Wells picked it up and whispered softly, "The end for now." But in his eyes there was unease. The game had been won, yet the force that had once taken hold of the child could return. The wind whispered through the village, and it seemed as if the darkness itself was quietly laughing. And somewhere deep in the forest, a faint red light flickered for a moment. Weeks passed. The village returned to its usual life, but the locals began to notice strange things more often. Rustling among the trees, shadows that moved on their own, and faint children's laughter drifting from the woods. Dr. Wells rarely left his home. Every morning he examined the doll resting on the shelf. It was empty and lifeless, but sometimes, when no one was looking, a faint red glimmer would flash in its hollow sockets. One night, the wind carried a whisper through a crack in the window, clear and familiar. The game isn't over. Emily was still out there, and the world the villagers thought was safe was now forever under the shadow of something they could never fully see. What do you think about this story? Does it seem like we've learned everything? Or are there mysteries still left unsolved? Perhaps the events we've told were only part of a much larger web of happenings we cannot yet imagine. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think such tragedies could have been prevented? And what lessons do they teach us today? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dark and forgotten episodes from the past, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and share this video with those who love true historical mysteries. In the next video, we'll uncover another shocking story that many have tried to forget. Don't miss it. Sometimes the past returns in the most unexpected forms.